Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 30 on Thursday. My name is Claire Prosser, and I am a Senior Manager here at Protiviti, managing our operations and partner relationships. For those of you joining us for the first time, this is a bi-weekly series. Our next 30 on Thursday will be on March 6th. Hold on if my screen will allow me to. There we go. One will be on March 6th, and we'll feature our own Kyle Schaefer talking about SharePoint REST services for designers. As always, our full schedule can be found by going to our website, sharepoint.protiviti.com/webinars. As well as our 30 on Thursday series, we do have a full schedule of more in-depth 3-hour webinars and 2-day online full training sessions. So if you're interested, again, take a look at our website. Another great event we have coming up is our SharePointConference.org. Now in its 7th year, we will be in Reston, Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C. on May 19th, and then in Dallas, Texas on October 20th. You will see you can use the coupon code 30T15 to get a 15% off your registration. This event provides both learning and networking opportunities, and we really hope to see you there. Okay, so back to today's session. We are recording the session, and you can take a look back at all of our previous webinars on the website. If you have any questions as we go along, please enter them in the question box on the right-hand panel, and we'll get to as many as we can after the presentation. So today we are pleased to welcome Mike Fleck from CipherPoint, who will be sharing with us the question of security on your SharePoint site. So welcome, Mike, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Claire.
I will just hand over to you. There we go.
Let me... All right, can everybody see the session overview slide? Okay. Claire, I think you're actually the only person that can confirm that.
I can see it. If you click onto your next slide, then
Yep.
There we go. Yep, it's working.
Let's get started. All right. Well, everyone, thanks for your time and interest this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are. And Claire, thanks to you and the rest of the folks at Protiviti for giving us the opportunity to share this information. So, just sort of a recap of the abstract for this session. And it is 30 on Thursday, so there are some time constraints here. But my goal is to give everyone that's attended a good cross-section of both high-level guidance on how to identify information privacy or compliance risk in SharePoint and create the business justification to do something about that, as well as some specific technical guidance to help you along your way. So really it'll break down into sort of 3 core sections here. Identify the risk. What are some of the things you can do, quote unquote, for free, right, using things that are available on SharePoint. And then for certain types of information or due to maybe some features that SharePoint doesn't have or hasn't focused on as much, what are some areas where you would consider third-party solutions or need third-party solutions to get the job done? And identifying risk is akin to opening the proverbial can of worms, but it's the necessary first step in what we're talking about today. At a high level, you need to understand what sensitive information your organization stores in SharePoint, how much of that information exists, should that information be in SharePoint, and if it should, what security controls need to be around that information versus what security controls do you actually have in place. And that's sort of the gap analysis and then the remediation plan, which is we have these deficiencies in our security controls. Here are the controls that we're going to put in place and how we're going to do that, or here are the things we'll do instead of those steps, what are called compensating controls. And if you don't have guidance on the required security controls for the types of information that we'll be talking about, you need to engage with your security team if you have one, or go get an outside consultancy, because these are a lot of types of things that folks like Protiviti would have done several times for several different organizations, so they can typically help you get to a point where you're on par with your peer group in the industry. So locating sensitive data is, I don't know that there's any one way to do that. I think you're always going to need at least one method. A few of the obvious options for finding sensitive information is just to look at the sites that you have in SharePoint. Admittedly, this may not be feasible based on kind of the scope of your topology, and we've seen folks that have thousands and thousands and thousands of sites and site collections. But get an idea of who's using SharePoint, and then basically walk down the hall or pick up the phone. Bear with me 1 second here, folks. Talk to or just interview the site owners for that. So, for example, if the HR team has a site, go talk to the site owner and human resources and find out how they're using it. Or have they built InfoPath web forms for job applicants to put in, some of the information they need to run credit checks or criminal background investigations. And you can start to do things like that and just learn how SharePoint is being used and whether or not, as a result of that use, you're likely to have sensitive information. SharePoint 2013 and previous versions have e-discovery and obviously search. Honestly, of the options, this is going to be maybe the least fulfilling because you are going to be really limited more to keywords and word association. So you're not going to be able to look for patterns such as credit card numbers or some sort of unique identifying number such as a social security number. And then finally, and a caveat, I don't usually make sort of blatant commercial pitches for products on these webinars. I try and stay more unbiased and educational. But CipherPoint does offer a content scanner that we've built as really an assessment tool. So it's a very quick and cost-effective way to help you identify how much sensitive information you have and where it is. So on the next two slides, I just have some quick screen captures. But basically, just to really kind of point out the difference between, say, e-discovery and search and what something like CipherPoint's content scanner can do. And there are other options, other similar products out there. But you can see that they'll identify patterns, and then there's also some amount of post-processing that happens to try and reduce what are called false positives. So this looks like a credit card number, but then there's some things you can do to actually verify, yeah, this actually passes the checks and really seems to be a valid credit card number. Just as sort of a word to the wise, what we've seen, Social Security numbers are very hard to accurately locate because really, truly, a Social Security number is a set of 9 random digits. There's not a lot of structure to it. There isn't a checked digit or something or some kind of algorithm really that you can run. So you will find there are pieces of information that, like I said, will just inherently create what are called false positives, which means it looks like you found some number of Social Security numbers, but some percentage of them are just 9 random digits. And then just a quick snapshot of what the content scanner will give you, and forgetting about the specifics of CipherPoint's commercial offering here, this is kind of where you want to get in this identifying risk phase is, again, what kind of sensitive information do I have, right? Do I have credit card numbers? Do I have Social Security numbers? Where is that information? And then, again, does it need to be there? So regardless of how you get to this point, this is sort of a literal view of kind of conceptually where you need to be. And then as we say, or as I say, insert meetings here. So now that you can confirm the existence of sensitive or regulated information, you need to figure out what to do. And this is not something that I believe an organization can put into a box, meaning a software company is not, I think, going to be able to repeatably fuse the I found data, now what do I do, because of a variety of factors, because of those false positives that we talked about, and because I believe each individual organization is going to have very specific thoughts, opinions, and requirements on what happens next. There may also be, especially if this is something you're doing, as really truly step one in this process, there's bound to be a lot of remediation and gap analysis that has to occur. So you're going to have to include the information owners, the site owners. If you have an information security team, if you have a risk or compliance team, you're going to have to engage with those people. Again, this is also a step where many people will bring in a third-party consultancy part so they can guide them in terms of what is the general industry doing, because you want to demonstrate due diligence with your industry, but also just to get that non-emotional appraisal and just really objectively identify what's going on, what should be happening, and those sorts of things. And that's where sort of an arm's length set of ears and eyes can help you. So getting into kind of the cleanup portion, right? You need to harden your environment if you haven't done so already. And this is not necessarily easy, but it is well documented. So the SharePoint, and it's not easy because SharePoint is a multi-tiered technology. It's not just SharePoint, it's also IIS, it's also SQL Server, it's also Windows Server operating systems. But the good news is, again, it is well documented. There are checklists produced by the U.S. federal government for properly configuring these technologies for security. It will take you some time, but it's not something you have to go by. The checklists are free. Your time is not free, but it is something that you're sort of fully in control of. Second, if you're doing any kind of extranet with SharePoint, you really need to make sure that you have the right architecture. It's getting better, but 2-3 years ago, we saw way too many instances of folks doing extranet type use cases, and they just simply extend a web application and then punch a hole in their firewall so people from the outside could come in via the public internet, effectively straight into their production farm. So if you're doing that, please stop. And if you're doing an extranet type thing, you really need to dedicate a web front end, as an example, to those extranet web applications. Isolate that web application on your network. Do logical isolation of that web application in terms of the authentication providers and the service accounts and those things. And the idea being, since that section of the farm will be attached to the internet, you want to reduce what's called the attack surface. So make the logical footprint of that server on the internet as small as possible, and then make it so that if somebody compromises that server in some way, it doesn't immediately give them a straight pass into your farm. The accounts that are used to run services on that server aren't going to be useful on the rest of the farm, those kinds of things. Liam Cleary actually has something up on SlideShare. So I believe if you search on Liam Cleary and keep prying eyes, it would probably be the keywords on SlideShare. You'll find a really good presentation that he's done on different farm architectures, where to put servers on different ports of the network, why you might do that from a use case standpoint, and the pros and cons. If you haven't looked at that and you have questions on farm architectures relative to security, it's a great read. And then obviously you found sensitive information. You have to align this information with some data classification scheme. And if you don't have one, get one. What you see here is an example of a typical 4-tier data classification approach. You can read this for yourselves, but public, it's almost on a scale of damage to the organization if the information was compromised or the confidentiality of the information was compromised. And restricted could also be compliance regulated. So if you're a healthcare company, as an example, or if you're a defense contractor working on ITAR, restricted information, that fourth bullet is really kind of where the meat is from a security standpoint, a security architecture standpoint. I believe you should be able to handle up to confidential data in this 4-tier model with just the out-of-the-box SharePoint options and good configuration change management practices. So kind of that previous slide on hardening and architecture. For restricted information, which again includes privacy regulated data such as patient information, you're going to need additional controls. You're going to need things that, quite honestly, SharePoint does not give you. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. And then once you settle on a classification scheme, apply it to your SharePoint sites. I mean, literally put a banner at the top of each of the sites with the classification. This is the human resources site where we're putting, very sensitive personnel data, so it is restricted, right? So the information you gathered from the earlier steps in terms of what sensitive information do we have, where is it, what are the, people who should have access to that, that plus your data classification scheme should inform that last bullet there. And then part of the cleanup is making sure that the SharePoint permissions align with your corporate role-based access control policies for that information. So it's not just restricted information, but is this human resources restricted information? Okay, well, who needs access to that? And you have to make sure that your SharePoint permissions are in alignment. And that's getting us into the next slide. And SharePoint permissions are the permissions management is the gift that keeps on giving. Permissions are incredibly hard to manage in SharePoint, and the native permissions reporting is pretty limited. There are some ways you can use PowerShell to get that visibility into your SharePoint topology in the current configuration settings. I recommend you do that at least quarterly, so every 90 days. Again, for the areas within SharePoint that require it, and I'd say that's maybe confidential enough. And then I also recommend that you enable a SharePoint auditing, which we'll talk about in a moment, to track the permissions changes to those site collections that have this kind of information. And those first two bullets talk about in a second, but don't forget to look in the access requests and invitation page under site settings, because there might be sort of pending accesses or pending sets of permissions that you'll see in there that you won't see under the regular permission settings. This is especially important if you're using SharePoint Online and you've enabled external sharing for a particular site collection. Because you can send an invitation. That invitation is good for 7 days, I believe, by default. And until somebody clicks that invitation, they won't actually show up as having permissions, even though they have potential permissions to that access. And finally, 80 groups, 80 security groups versus SharePoint permissions groups, pick one and go with it. I like using Active Directory since it allows me to directly tie how role-based access control is managed via Active Directory and tie that directly to how role-based access control is managed in SharePoint. This assumes, though, that your SharePoint permissions needs will always parallel your Active Directory group membership, and that may not always be the case when you're getting into maybe external access or contractors, those kinds of things. And remember, permissions are not security. Again, this is evolving a little bit in the SharePoint community, but 3 years ago, if you said security, people started talking about permissions management. Permissions are one layer of control, and based on the sensitivity or the classification of your information, you need multiple levels of control to have security. And then circling back here to these top two, these are just examples of some things that are available either through PowerShell, or well, I think you get to both of those through PowerShell. You know, and it's just sort of the thread to pull on. So if you ran this get spuser-web command in the SharePoint PowerShell, you would start to see where, okay, if I took that and I piped that output to this other command and those types of things, and then looped through, you know, you can start to build those permissions, SharePoint permissions reports that you can't get through the central admin console, but you can get by writing some PowerShell scripts. And there's a lot of information on the internet on how to do this. So there are several examples. I did find in doing the research that many of the examples are oriented around for a specific user, show me all the objects in SharePoint that they have access to. So do a little bit more digging, and you'll find some example scripts on how to just get a dump of all the permissions in a particular web app. But very useful, again, and do it on some iteration. I like 90 days. And then finally, activity logging. So you've hardened the configuration. You have your servers in the right places in your network. You have some best practices, network defenses in place. You've dealt with permissions. And sorry, one thing I didn't talk about permissions is inheritance, which is that second bullet there. You know, this is going to probably cause the phone to ring, but maybe that's okay. Feel free to reset inherit any kind of broken inheritance as part of this cleanup. If there's stuff that broke inheritance and there was good justification for that, again, your phone will probably ring, but you know that's okay. At least then you can document it. You can start to, if you haven't already accounted for it, start to put procedures in place to deal with that and monitor that going forward. So on the activity logging, you know, two high-level things that you want to audit are access to content, as well as the administrative activity around those locations. Really, if nothing else, the permissions changes. SharePoint does have native auditing. It's under site settings for the site collection. You know, the native auditing is not equal between on-premises SharePoint and SharePoint Online. So if you're thinking about moving to Office 365 and the native auditing is something that has been useful or you hope will be useful in the future, pay special attention to what you're going to get out of SharePoint Online, because it is not the same as on-premises SharePoint. You know, the big thing with the SharePoint auditing, it's there, it's somewhat configurable. You know, is it human readable? Not really, right? There are a lot of GUIDs, there are a lot of just, you know, numeric values that don't have the mapping into, you know, human readable English. There are a lot of third-party products that will you know, either do the auditing for you or will help you turn the native auditing into something that's more easily understood. And you know, because there are so many, again, if you're already doing work with somebody like Protiviti, I'm sure they've surveyed the field. They can recommend the best of breed based on your requirements, if in fact you need something more than what you get out of the box. And last thing here, especially for the restricted data, you want to keep that audit for 18 months. I know that's a long time, but most people don't find out that their information has been stolen until almost a year after it started to happen. So maintaining 18 months will give your security or your forensics team a chance to go back and figure out how the breach occurred, what information may have been compromised, etc. So very, very important to maintain that visibility and that historical perspective for that length of time. So you're going to have to plan your storage requirements accordingly. If you're in a larger organization, your security team may already have a centralized kind of enterprise log management solution. They'd love for you to feed more logs into that thing because they paid good money for it and they want to get more value out of it. If you don't, you know, there's a lot of open source you know, databases out there. SharePoint can archive things in the, a document library. So that there are several different options. As I mentioned, securing restricted information or compliance-regulated information is going to require additional software. And this isn't specific to SharePoint. Effectively, every kind of non-specialized application environment that I've ever seen needs to be made more robust in order to handle things like patient information or credit card numbers, trade secrets, military intelligence, right? So it's not that SharePoint is necessarily deficient or unique. It's just that level of confidentiality information requires specialized software, which you're not going to get out of a general purpose platform. So best practices controls are going to include things like two-factor authentication, which is basically something like a password, and something you have, like your mobile phone. So some of the things you're starting to see commonly for two-factor authentication is your username, your password, and then you'll get a code texted to your phone, and you put that in as that second factor. Microsoft recently bought a company called PhoneFactor, maybe a year ago, and they've made that available via Azure. So there is a Microsoft two-factor authentication service that's available. Good guess that any two-factor authentication solution is going to require some integration with SharePoint, but it is a great control for remote or administrative access to areas in SharePoint that have restricted information. And especially now with everybody having a smartphone, it's much less expensive to implement and manage two-factor authentication than it used to be. The next thing, permissions management, we talked about that, gift that keeps on giving. I don't necessarily believe that you require a third-party permissions management solution, but it certainly makes your life easier. And to the extent that you can better manage things and get some automation, you're less likely to make mistakes. Again, you can get the job done without a third-party solution, but you're going to have some compensating controls. I'm trying to speed up here because I know I'm short on time. Data at rest encryption, increasingly common, but you always need to ask why. Why do we want to encrypt this information? And the answer will inform what type of encryption you need. So, for example, people will say they want to encrypt data. If you ask them why, they'll say because they want to keep site collection administrators or outside attackers from being able to see this information in SharePoint. And if that's the case, something like SQL TDE is not going to help you. TDE is really appropriate more for physical loss or theft or some of the kind of check-the-box encryption requirements. If you have security issues at the application level, you're going to need something that does encryption within SharePoint. Rights management, touch on that real briefly. Very promising technology, next to impossible to implement beyond a very small, highly motivated user base. Rights management is just very annoying to users. The example I always give to people is when iTunes had really tight controls over the songs you downloaded and what devices you could play it on and things like that. It's just too restrictive. And then finally, DLP, or data loss prevention. This is a control that monitors the network to alert on users that may be sending information outside of the company or outside of established role-based access control policies. It's very expensive, very long implementation cycles, so it's not something that I would recommend going and procuring and doing just for a SharePoint environment. But if you already have it within your environment, get some extra value out of that. Something to keep in the back of your mind. The only DLP product that integrates with SharePoint the right way, aka via the API, is the one from EMC RSA. So if you have another DLP solution, might be a perfectly good solution, you may not get as much out of it relative to SharePoint that you might get for, say, a file server or for Exchange or something like that. So I know I went a little bit longer. Really appreciate everybody's attention today. And Claire, I'll kind of defer to you on what you want to do in terms of Q&A.
Thanks, Mike. You know, I only had one question and you've actually answered it right there. Someone asked for your name, so there we go again. That was Mike Fleck from CipherPoint. If you have any further questions, you can get in touch with Mike directly or reach out to us here at Protiviti, and we will happily help you guys out. Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll hope to see you back here in a couple of weeks for our next 30 on Thursday. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Be well. Bye.